Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into Season 4 of the Vimy Foundation's podcast, Beyond the Ridge, a series exploring Canada's contributions to the First World War and the experts who continue to uncover our past. Join us this season as we discuss the topic of forgotten fronts, where we are covering stories of lesser-known areas of the war. My name is Caitlin Bailey, and I'll be your host for the English season of this podcast. While many Canadians are familiar with the story of Canada and Newfoundland on the Western Front, Newfoundland's first military engagement was actually the Gallipoli campaign. This campaign, which took place in 1915 to 1916 within the Balkan Front, aimed to control the strategic Dardanelles Strait and involved a significant naval and land operations, and is probably better known as a place of memory for the Anzac countries. But the Newfoundland Regiment also participated in this challenging and ultimately unsuccessful campaign, which concluded with an amphibious evacuation in the winter of 1916. However, for us, it is the subsequent Battle of the Somme on July 1st, 1916, that has become the central event in Newfoundland's memory of the First World War. Here to talk a little bit more to us today is Dr. Jane McGaughey, who is the Johnson Chair of Quebec and Canadian Irish Studies at Concordia University, and a historian with a Ph.D. from Birkbeck College at the University of London. She's the author of Ulster's Men, Protestant Unionist Masculinities and Militarization in the North of Ireland, 1912 to 1923, and Violent Loyalties, Manliness, Migration, and the Irish in Canada, 1798 to 1841. Jane is also the host of the Irish in Canada podcast, where she explores the stories of Irish immigrants and their descendants. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jane.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So your work, as we've mentioned, primarily focuses on Irish Canadian history, as well as gender and militarization. But today we're going to ask you some questions about an area of focus that you've dealt with before as well, which is the memory of the Battle of Gallipoli in Newfoundland. So can you tell us a little bit more about your work on that topic and how you became interested in it?
I came to it because I was doing my PhD looking at the Irish divisions that were fighting in the Great War. And so I went to Gallipoli in 2011. And when I was there, I was noticing a lot of Newfoundland flags when I was going through the cemeteries. And so that got me interested in not just Irish troops who were there, but troops that had a heavy Irish ethnicity as well. The Anzacs obviously would have done too, but so did troops from Newfoundland. So I started to think about how Ireland and Newfoundland compared at this point, because Ireland at that point was part of the UK, and Newfoundland was its own dominion. And that led me into looking at the experiences of the men when they were part of the battle that was not as famous as when the Anzacs landed in April.
Absolutely. And, you know, as we said before, the primary memory, I think the public memory of the Newfoundland Regiment and the experience of Newfoundland in the First World War really is the Battle of the Somme. And, you know, Gallipoli is the first engagement, but it's kind of been lost in that fog, the fog of war, as we'll call it, in that kind of fog of memory. So you mentioned seeing flags in the cemeteries from Newfoundland. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of the memory of Gallipoli in Newfoundland and how it's been commemorated over the years?
It was quite well known immediately afterwards. I looked a lot at the press reports that were coming out through the end of 1915 and early 1916, so things before the Somme. And up until the Somme, Gallipoli was the main campaign that a lot of people around the world were really focusing on. Then it continued after, through the late 1910s into the 1920s. But then something odd happened when they were building what they called the Trail of the Caribou, which is where a lot of the caribou statues were put up at places where the Newfoundlanders had fought, primarily on the Western Front. Gallipoli was left off. There was talk that they would be included. It was expected. But then you got later into the late 1920s, the 1930s, economic depression, to the Second World War, and it just didn't happen. And so when I was there, I was aware that this monument was missing. It was something that I had seen when I had gone to Beaumont Hamel, I had expected that it would be there. They even have the hill that the Newfoundlanders took is called Caribou Hill. But it wasn't there when I was there in 2011. And so that was kind of my in for what I was writing, was to look at this sense of forgotten memory. It now is there.
Yes, yeah.
It was put up in 2021, and then was officially commemorated in 2022 after it was safer post-COVID. So the memory is coming back, and we find that a lot with Gallipoli, that the memory with Australia and New Zealand has always been there, right? It's their Vimy. It's their moment of conceptualization as nations, and all of the sort of familiar themes we're used to from 20th century historiography.
Yes, yeah.
But it also was very much a part of Irish history and was deliberately forgotten. It was part of Newfoundlander history, but then was overshadowed. So I often think of something like the Somme as kind of like, well, forgive me, but kind of like the Vimy Monument, this huge towering structure that has, depending on how you're looking at it, the shadow can fall forwards or backwards. So the Somme can color things going onwards from 1916, but it definitely shadowed over things that had happened in 1914 and 15 as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that is, it's a common statement about Vimy as well. It's a common complaint about Vimy, the idea of the myth of Vimy and what it did to things before and things after. And there are endless arguments about the actual value of it, and was it as strategic as everybody thought it was, all those kinds of things. The Somme obviously has a huge tragic element to it that I think for a lot of people has come to define the image of the First World War as well. That kind of flower of youth heading out to do something pointless and continuing to send people out despite repeated failure. And the Newfoundland Regiment at the Somme was not part of the first wave, correct? They were second or third wave and sent out anyway.
And of course had the absolutely horrific casualty result from it. So one can understand why that moment, the 1st of July, would be going forward that much more of something to think about and literally memorialize for Memorial Day. But Gallipoli then kind of was claimed in different ways. Turkey claimed it as their own, national moment with Ataturk leading the troops. And certainly when I was growing up, Gallipoli was the Mel Gibson movie. It was very, very Anzac driven and very anti-colonial, and had a very, I think that was made in about 1980, 81. So had a certain political bent to it.
Absolutely.
And so when I started to look at Gallipoli first during my PhD, no one was really talking about what the Irish had done there. There have been a few books. And certainly I think there'd been one article that had been written by P. Whitney Lackenbauer about more generally what the Newfoundlanders had done. There was no more recent historiography, just sort of the official regimental history. So I was wanting to try and look at it from a different angle, and by doing that, it made me reconceptualize where Newfoundland fit within my own work of looking at the Irish around the world.
Absolutely. I mean, the population was heavily populated by Irish immigrants, and continues, I think, to have a fairly proud connection to a lot of those pieces of Irish culture that have, of course, evolved and changed and everything else. How would you say that the concept of kind of the let's call it the Irish in Newfoundland during the First World War differs from, for example, Canada and the communities in Montreal, or the situation in Ireland itself, where everything was really tied into, the Easter Rising and the IRA and loyalties and religion and all of those questions?
With what I was looking at, I should sort of foreground it with, I didn't have a lot of diaries or personal letters. So what I was reading was part of, if you want, the propaganda, but also part of the afterthought of it, looking at veterans magazines in 1918, 1919, early 1920s. So it does have a certain possible slant on it, which I'm well aware of. But what I was looking at was really this sense that to be Irish and Newfoundland meant that you also were very much part of the empire. And that wasn't something that they then rejected immediately after the Somme or after the armistice. And that it continued to be something as a sort of cornerstone of pride. And in that way, you know, some of the Irish Canadians were very aware of things like the Easter Rising and how that affected recruitment here in Montreal, where I am right now, or different pushes that orange and green factions would have in Canada. You had orange and green elements in Newfoundland. That was centuries old, but there was a concerted effort to move past that I read in a lot of the newspaper reports before Gallipoli and then during the campaign as well, really trying to show that if you were an Irish Catholic and from Newfoundland, that didn't mean that you couldn't also be very proud of wearing the uniform that you were in. And for the rest of the 20th century, the majority of Irish opinion, looking back, said that that wasn't how the Irish really wanted to see themselves, particularly from the Republic. And so Newfoundland was an outlier. And it was also a bit of an outlier for how I structured it, because everywhere else seemed to get a name drop. And the Newfoundlanders never really did. When there was a roll call of all of the different nations and dominions that were coming to fight, particularly for Gallipoli, they were left off. They were not mentioned. You can look at it the same way with a lot of the war posters. And there's one that I always showed in my classes, which has, you know, the British lion and then these sort of cubs behind, and it lists Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And Newfoundland is technically the oldest colony, and referred to itself in the propaganda that way, at least at home, but wasn't getting the same kind of respect as soon as, you know, you left Newfoundland's boundaries. And so Gallipoli tried to, it was a moment where that could have started to rectify itself. But because of when the Newfoundlanders arrived, Gallipoli was already a disaster.
Yes.
So it wasn't really going to be that kind of either triumphant moment that you get in some places in the war, or that horrible tragedy that would then happen to them within the year at the Somme.
Yeah, absolutely. That it's very much like it's a middle child. We'll call it a middle child.
it has that feeling to it.
That kind of feeling. And I mean, the thing that was interesting for me, at least, when I first started looking at learning a little bit about Gallipoli, and of course, you know, as you said, my entire conception of Gallipoli was the film Gallipoli that I watched in high school as part of, you know, the teaching that we did around the First World War. We watched that and it was like, it made you cry and, you know, all these things. And Mel Gibson was young and had all this hair and, you know, it was like, oh, and he didn't follow orders and, and that was very much, you know, kind of the vision that I had out of it. And I had absolutely no idea. And then I learned, you know, about I think it was the book was The Trail of the Caribou, and they were talking about how they were known originally as the blue putties because they had blue leg wraps.
Yes, they did. Yes, they stood out, definitely.
Yeah, and they stood out. You know, they were wearing safari helmets and blue leg wraps, and so that was always kind of that became known as, you know, there was the symbol of on the Western Front of the old British professional army called the Old Contemptibles, who had fought in 1914. And then there was the same kind of idea of a blue putty, and that you were someone who had survived not only the Somme and, you know, the campaigns Monchy-le-Preux and, you know, the many campaigns in which the Newfoundland Regiment really suffered, you had also survived Gallipoli. And that's a handful of people, really, when you think about it. It's not that many.
No, very
managed to make it all the way through.
I think we're talking about certainly less than 150.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of, I think, for, you know, the part of that Somme memory as well is the fact that it was every family lost at least one person, usually more than one.
The population was so small. It's, you know, less than a quarter, about 200,000 people, I believe, around 1914. So yeah, you were going to be heavily affected, especially when the recruiting drive, and I have that great big seesaw on recruiting, so I should in my head.
Yes, yeah.
But the recruiting drive was very successful at the beginning, and then there was the sad cost that came with that.
Yeah, yeah. And where a family would lose all the male members of the family. I'm thinking of I think it's the Eyre. Is it the Eyre family? Eyre that, lost something like 6 people.
I was just reading again the other day about the Murphy family.
Yes.
And one of 3 brothers, one of them died in the hospital at Lemnos, having fought at Gallipoli. And so you get this, yeah, it's a family affair, certainly.
Yeah, yeah.
And then when you think of the way that, these are small villages for the most part. So just the rhythm of life would have been so tremendously affected.
So disrupted. Yeah, exactly. And I sort of a thought that's just popped into my head. I know one of the comments around the centenary of the influenza epidemic, and our pandemic and all of that, those things, that one of the comments was that the influenza epidemic killed in Canada as many or more people than the First World War, but is not at all thought about in comparison to the deaths of the First World War, and that to be a soldier in the First World War, to die of influenza, was basically just to be kind of, one of many nameless people. And Gallipoli for the Newfoundlanders was significantly marked, and for Anzacs as well, was significantly marked by disease.
Horribly.
And all of the illnesses that came with that, and people ending up with cholera, and the massive amounts of illness. And so again, a death from an illness, a death from cholera in Alexandria that you contracted at Gallipoli
it doesn't have the same ring.
Doesn't have the same ring
No.
to it.
No, and they were inheriting dugouts from a lot of Scottish regiments, and they'd been literally dug in, and so disease was already rampant, and they were walking right into it. If you go to Gallipoli, it's a very expansive battlefield, but when you actually go to the areas where the men lived, it's so crowded, it's so small, so you can understand how contagion would just run riot. So yeah, things like cholera, malaria. It's a the landscape is a very odd one if you're used to the Western Front. It's very arid and yet also salt and marsh, and so yeah, things could horribly travel. And they didn't have great food. The nutrition was lacking severely. So it's a lot of beef jerky and dried biscuits and weevils and yeah, all of it. So they didn't have that facade of glory that certainly a lot of the Anzacs leaned into in their memorialization, at least in the first few decades after the battle. And similarly, even the British, Scottish, Irish troops who showed up closer in the summer had a different type of campaign at Gallipoli than the Newfoundlanders did.
Absolutely. You mentioned that you were looking at the stories of individuals at Gallipoli as much as you could. And so are there any that really stood out to you? Is there one that was, kind of the Gallipoli story for you?
Well, there's sort of 2. One is more about a group, but like the names that come down, are sort of really tied to the cemeteries in some ways. So, Hugh McWhirter, who was the first to be killed in action when a shell exploded. And then it was within 24 hours, then there were more deaths from the regiment. With Caribou Hill, the name that really resounds more is J.J. Donnelly, who was leading the attack. But the one that I really love isn't actually in Gallipoli, it's in Alexandria just before they went. And it's leaning into every stereotype, so forgive me, but there was a bar fight between
Why not?
between the Anzacs and the Newfoundlanders, and I'm not going to do an Aussie accent, but apparently the legend is that one of them left and then ran into a friend and was like, "Don't mess with the guys with the goat on their cap," because of course an Aussie would never have seen a caribou.
Yes, yeah.
wouldn't know anything about the insignia, but just, they had this reputation for being fighters, for being robust. A lot of the letters that we do have from officials and from the officers are really focus on the men's bodies a lot. How hale and hardy, and oddly pairing it with the fact that some of them are very short and yet stout, and they can last, and that they expect this sort of physicality to carry them through the entire war. And with what I look at with masculinity, people often are like, well, is this some kind of gay subtext to it? And I'm like, it could be. Homoeroticism can go many different ways, but I often think of it in tandem with the disease that you were mentioning, and the fact that you then have this focus on bodies being torn apart and being killed, and all of the maiming and amputees, and the way that disease would wither people. And so in a lot of what I did find at places like the Imperial War Museum and in some of the newspapers was this focus on the body of the Newfoundlanders as this point of pride. And then that just makes you start to think, well, then what would happen to these bodies? It also is a way of oddly depersonalizing a lot of the history, which then makes it that much harder to, again, find those compelling personal anecdotes, because we're really thought of almost as a monolithic force at times.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that vision of kind of the robust colonial man, that a lot of that applied to Canada as well. You read sometimes certainly the writing that Douglas Haig did to his wife, or even General Byng to some of his compatriots when he was appointed to lead the forces before Vimy, and it was always about how big and tall and wide-chested all of these Canadians were, and there was this idea of the woodsman and the bushman, and the person who was not someone who grew up in a factory in Manchester with polluted air, and had been working since the age of 5 in a spinning shop, and there was
a different kind of man.
They were a different kind of man, and there was a lot of I guess moral panic as well in Britain around the First World War, in that so many of the initial enlistees didn't meet the height or weight requirements.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can see that also going back to the Second Boer War, and the fact that you get things like the Boy Scouts.
Yes.
I mean, that panic. I mean, the 1800s are a whole moral panic about degeneracy that many people have written about, but there are echoes of it certainly that last well into the war years and beyond.
Yeah. And that concept of, like, the colonial man who doesn't follow the rules, and he's,
part of it. The ones that I would read for Gallipoli often involved swimming. A lot of focus on either bodies being brought back, having been shelled, or naked men swimming. And so when I did find letters and diaries, that was often part of it. That was in it, where focus on either the Newfoundlanders, but to a much larger extent looking at the Anzacs, because they also were fitting that colonial masculinity. And the diaries that I was able to look at were usually very brief in what they did provide, and so that kind of comment really then stood out that much more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that kind of brings me to my next question in terms of the challenge of presenting or looking at the memory of something like Gallipoli in that context. You've mentioned there aren't a lot of personal accounts. So what are some of the challenges with that?
There are several. Part of it is always the issue of access. Certainly when I was doing my work on Gallipoli, very few things were digitized. And so the need to get to different places, it's one of the reasons why I could never write properly about the Anzacs, because as a grad student, I couldn't afford to go down to Sydney. And so there are, a lot of really rich materials about the Newfoundland Regiment at the rooms in Newfoundland. But when I was working on it, you needed to get there physically. So that's less of an issue now, because more and more things are being digitized, but then it's the question of what's being prioritized. And are we having, in a way, something like Gallipoli being overshadowed again in the need to get out information about the more memorialized campaigns? So that was one. The other thing is that I made a choice when I went into the work, knowing some of the limitations I had geographically, was that I wanted to look at the public discourse.
Mm.
That I find personal accounts really illuminating, but it also can bring in a whole other set of skills that you need to try and pick that apart. So what I was doing was looking at public statements that were being made, or letters being written that officers knew would probably end up being seen by more than one person. And so the tone would be charged, would be quite different than it might have been if someone was writing to their sibling or their parents. But I was fascinated with that because the way that, I mean, we see it now, the way that the media can change how people perceive things has been powerful, you know, back when we only had the printed press. And so that was one of the ways that I was able to work with sources that I could access from where I was physically, but it's also something I'm always really interested in, that public discourse that surrounds ideas about manhood and war and loyalty, and where different geographic regions fit within a more global network.
Yeah, and I think too, you know, there's that we forget having the access that we do to all of these wonderful digitized documents. We forget what it was like to do it in the old days.
15 years ago.
15 years ago, exactly. I was doing thesis research at that point on a specific branch of Russian lit, and it was, you know, very difficult to do anything. There was nothing digitized, and the state library was, likely still is, very heavily controlled, and actually being able to get in and look at things. And then on top of it, there were the many layers of, you know, purges and re-evaluations and different ideological visions of, you know, this same movement over and over and over 100 years. But it's definitely the availability of those digitized records has just changed it so much.
Absolutely.
Even from 15 years ago.
It really has. It's a whole new world. And in that way, it can be really exciting. But it also, we still sometimes have the problem that just having what we would hope would be lengthy reflections from someone who survived Gallipoli and the Somme, and you know, written not as a memoir, but at the time, that's kind of the gold standard, but it's not always there. Because it depends so much on how people decided to preserve things. You know, I'm always begging my students, don't get rid of your emails, print them out, because someone might need them someday in 200 years. So that kind of source issue definitely affected some of how I approached Gallipoli. And I don't think it's necessarily the same across the board, but it's, you know, it is in a very different part of the war. It has different emphases. And so I think someone who is looking at memory and masculinity and the Irish connection the way I was, if they were writing about New Zealand, might have a completely different experience with the sources than I did.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're getting to the point of the end of our interview. I did have one thing that I wanted to ask you. You know, you mentioned that there is now a caribou at Gallipoli in 2021. In 2024, this is the year of the bringing home of the unknown Newfoundland soldier to the National War Memorial in St. John. And that soldier is, of course, a soldier at the Somme.
Yes.
So, you know, we're re-looking at we're looking at that. We're seeing that again of this memory coming forward. We are over 100 years past these events. Why should we continue to keep reevaluating these things? Why should we keep looking at Gallipoli and trying to think, you know, does it need a place here or does it not? Is it something that we should just say, well, you know, there's other stuff, or is it something we should keep looking at?
I mean, I'm coming at this because with what I was looking at for Irish studies, you know, we had a decade of remembrance recently, 1912 to 23.
Yes, yeah.
It was a very long period, and Gallipoli did get a place in that. I think that it's always really important to look to the past so that not just that we can draw lessons and see the connections, but also because these are stories of people who lived, and any way that we can have to still remember them, I think is absolutely fundamental. When the Canadian unknown soldier arrived in Ottawa, I remember there being commentary that it couldn't be a Newfoundlander, and some lamenting about that in some op-eds. And so I was really glad to see that it happened this summer. And I felt that even if it's someone from the Somme, I don't want to prioritize one battlefield over another. It's just making sure that that kind of memory is central. There's a reason why so many cities across Canada and Newfoundland, would have the cenotaph as being sort of the center of the town, because it was a way of making sure that it was with you every day. And I used to not want to ever write about the First World War when I was a student because I thought it was too tragic and too emotional. And then, of course, it was something that I ended up studying, because it is this really fundamental point for how we live now. It's one of those events that just defines so much. And so being able to look at different parts of it and not only have that one image of the Western Front and the trenches there, and to really recognize, no, this was a world war. And what does that mean? And I think Gallipoli fits really well into that discussion, because it's not the Blackadder image, right? It's something different, and yet we have people from this country now that since 1949 with Newfoundland joining, that's part of our shared history, and I think it's really important to not lose sight of that, and to always find a place for it.
Absolutely. Well, and your point too, that we call it a world war, often we don't recognize it as a world war in the way that you might in the Second World War with the Pacific Front and things like that. But it was very much a war that involved all of the continents, with the exception of Antarctica. It was again a world war, and Gallipoli is a really good reminder of that. So thank you so much for joining us. We're so happy to have you with us. You are the host of the Irish in Canada podcast. So where can our listeners find you, and when is your next episode coming out?
So you can find us at the Irish in Canada podcast.ca, and we're available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and wherever else you might download things. And we have 3 seasons that are out. We have ended the podcast for the time being. We haven't ruled out at some point coming back. But 3 seasons of storytelling was a lot, and a lot of fun. But I wanted to make sure that it wasn't getting stale either. And so for the time being, we have a range of different stories. They're all about sort of 15 to 20 minutes. And so it covers from about 1756 all the way up to some of the present day issues too. So we had a really fun run with it, and I would love it if people wanted to check it out.
Super, thank you so much. So thank you again for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you talking about Newfoundland and the forgotten Battle of Gallipoli. And I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us as part of the 4th season of Beyond the Ridge. We're inviting you to stay tuned. We've got a lot of forgotten fronts for you this year. We're looking to explore topics including our own Canada's own forgotten front, the Battle of Ypres, munitions production as another activity that Canadians often don't think about, and my personal favorite, which I'm always pushing for, the Siberian Expeditionary Force. So thank you, Jane, and please join us next time.